Let's bring in now Liberal Senator and Chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, James Paterson. Senator Paterson, thanks for your time. The polling improving for you and the coalition, and the betting markets tightening. Is there a bit more of a spring in the step of you and your colleagues today?
Kieran, it will be a very bad habit to me to start commenting on polls now, let alone betting markets. But I think Australians are contemplating the choice that they face. And in a risky and uncertain time, I think they're starting to have some pretty severe doubts as to whether or not Anthony Albanese is really up to it. I mean, we saw half a dozen stuff-ups in the first week of the campaign on economic policy, on national security policy, on borders. I think they're entitled to wonder whether or not he's actually ready for the job.
In a reminder how tricky getting all the stats and the numbers right can be, the Prime Minister stumbled a little today on the job seeker number. Is that a reminder that the potholes remain for both sides?
Oh, look, the Prime Minister clearly misspoke. He was talking about the daily rate and he said it was weekly. That's a pretty minor verbal stumble in the scheme of things, Kieran. We're all guilty of that from time to time. I don't claim perfection in that regard. And someone like him who has to stand up every single day and answer questions, a very minor technical breach like that, I think it can be excused. And I think no one seriously doubts whether Scott Morrison is up to it or across the detail. He's been Prime Minister for 3.5 years through the most difficult times our countries have faced, whether that's floods or fires, a pandemic, or indeed very serious conflict, very serious war on the other side of the world. He's demonstrated time and again that he's up to that.
A number of your colleagues in Melbourne and elsewhere around the nation facing a real challenge from the so-called teal independents. The Prime Minister not ruling out potentially doing a deal with them to form a minority government if it comes to that after May 21. Is that just simply keeping the options open?
Kieran, I think we should call them the so-called independents rather than the so-called teal independents, because as you know, many of them are former members of the Labor Party. They're only running against Liberals and they are clearly trying to remove the government from power, not help us return to power. I mean, if you just look at the arithmetic, Labor has a much more difficult task in winning majority government. They have to take about 10 seats in order to form majority government. We don't have that challenge. And so if you are concerned about what happens out of a minority parliament, a hung parliament negotiations, you'd be much more concerned about what Labor would do if they were forced to negotiate with the Greens, for example, or with some of these independents, not with the government. We've got a much better chance of forming a majority government after the election.
You've got a few challenges internally, though. In the seat of Warringah, the candidate there copping some internal flack from Matt Keane, the New South Wales Treasurer. Today, you've got the president of the Neutral Bay branch within Warringah calling for her to be disendorsed. A lot of Liberals apparently uncomfortable with Catherine Deves' approach.
Kieran, I'm a Victorian Liberal Senator. Last thing I want to do is wade into New South Wales Liberal Party matters. I don't know many of the personalities involved. I think it's appropriate that Catherine Deves has apologised because, in particular, I don't think anyone in public life in Australia should ever refer to the Holocaust or Nazis as a point of reference for our disagreements here in Australia. But they were comments that she made as a private citizen before she put her hand up for public office. And I think she is sincere in her apologies. And I think it would be a bad precedent to cancel people for public life if they've previously erred on social media. If we applied that standard, well then Mr Rapacholi, the Labor candidate for Hunter, Joel Fitzgibbon's old seat, wouldn't be allowed to stand. Many other people of talent in public life wouldn't be able to make a contribution. I think the test is when these issues are raised, when they come to the fore, do you take responsibility, do you apologise? And she's done so.
Let's turn to area of your focus, and that is security, foreign and domestic. We're seeing an incursion really in terms of the local region, authority in the region from China in terms of its draft deal with the Solomons. Is this the government dropping the ball in our own backyard despite talking up a big game when it comes to national security?
Kieran, I don't think that's a fair criticism at all. I mean, the Solomon Islands is a sovereign democracy and is in charge of its own destiny and has a right to self-determination, and it's not appropriate for Australia or any other country to dictate to it, and we would never, ever seek to do so. All we're seeking to do is to point out to the Solomons why it might not be in their national interest, why we don't believe it's in our national interest, and why it will be destabilising for the region to have a Chinese military presence or permanent presence on the Solomon Islands. It is very clearly would be destabilising to the region, and it's not only us that said that, many others in the region have said that. And so we're just urging them to carefully consider that. What I think the events in the Solomons do show is the foresight in the way in which the government has stepped up in the Pacific, and particularly the way in which we've refocused our international aid program to our own neighbourhood rather than trying to do good deeds over the whole globe. We've recognised that as a regional power with global interests, that the best thing we can do is support countries in our region, and we've got a very generous program of support, not just for the Solomons, but other countries in the Pacific, and I'm very proud of that.
You got the Greens today saying that the Solomons is a sovereign country seeking to build relationships with its regional neighbours as best it can, that the Greens see this as a double standard, as paternalistic and actually racist, some of the critique of this Solomons-China deal. What do you say to that?
Well, that's utterly absurd and frankly offensive rhetoric from the Greens, who clearly are not informed about what they're talking about. We've adopted a very respectful approach to the Solomons. We are not trying to dictate to them at all. As I said in my previous answer, Kieran, we're just trying to explain to them what we think the consequences of this decision would be for them and for the region as well as for us. And then it's up to them to make their own judgment. The Greens also proposed in that same interview to slash defence spending in what the Prime Minister has called the most dangerous strategic environment since World War II, and no serious national security expert has disagreed with that assessment. I mean, these are truly insane plans from the Greens. They also said that we should close Pine Gap. I've visited that joint defence facility, Kieran, and been briefed about its contribution to our intelligence collection. And without going into any classified material at all, our decision to close that would be effectively a decision to blind our men and women in uniform serving, and to turn off the lights and to say that we're not interested in what's happening in our region, that we don't want to observe the actions of our potential adversaries. It's a truly insane proposal. Of course, Kieran, the Greens having wacky national security and defence policies is not that surprising. What is more concerning is their ability to influence a future Labor government.
Well, the Labor opposition has said if they form government, they would not engage in any sort of deal with the Greens, power sharing or anything of the sort. And clearly their foreign policy, as you know, through the bipartisan work of the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, there's a lot of bipartisanship, isn't there? You're in a senior position, you don't want to downplay that, surely.
Certainly there is on the PJCIS, Kieran, and I've worked well with my Labor counterparts on that. But the Labor Party, of course, always says before elections, don't worry, we wouldn't enter into a power sharing agreement with the Greens. But last time they were in government, that's exactly what they did. And in fact, Anthony Albanese was the Deputy Prime Minister in that government that had a power sharing arrangement with the Greens. So he clearly doesn't have any kind of personal objection or philosophial objection to serving in government with the Greens.
But do you think Labor would let them drive foreign policy and security policy? It's hard to see.
Well, let's just look at the record, Kieran. When they were in a power sharing agreement with the Greens in the last parliament which they served, they reduced our defence spending to 1.56% of GDP, the lowest level since 1938. They ripped millions of dollars out of the Australian Federal Police. They subjected our intelligence agencies, including ASIO, to an extra efficiency dividend that effectively cut their spending by their budgets by 4% every year. Anthony Byrne, my predecessor as PJCIS chair, had to stand up in the parliament and denounce his own government for the damage it was doing to national security. And that was all when they were in a power sharing agreement with Adam Bandt and other Greens. So I don't put it past them to do it again. If the only thing standing between Anthony Albanese and the Prime Ministership is a deal with Adam Bandt, what do you think he's going to do? Do you really think he's going to turn down the opportunity to serve?
Yeah, I guess the question is the link that you're drawing between the Greens and their foreign and security policy. Very different worldviews, you'd concede that.
Well, I really hope so, Kieran, but all we can do with them is judge them by their record. I don't think we can say that their rhetoric alone is worth judging them by. I think we have to look at what they did when they were last in office, and that shows that they are comfortable doing deals with the Greens and that it comes at the expense of our national security. I mean, this is a government, when they were last in power, that failed to order a single naval vessel in 6 years, despite the 2009 defence paper on their watch saying we urgently needed 12 conventionally powered submarines. They didn't order one. So that is their legacy, and they've got to live up to that.
Chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, James Paterson. Great to chat as always. Thanks.
Thanks, mate.